Howdy y'all, I'm Mickey. I, like most people, love media. I love fiction, I love writing myself, and I love reading other people's fiction. And with enough exposure to fictional media, you start to notice the tropes that keep coming up, including the rather problematic ones. In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of those tropes that is called multiple names. For this video, I'm going to just refer to it as the barrier gaze trope. If you have no idea what this trope is, just haven't picked it up, it's the media tendency to give queer characters very little screen time or development before killing off that character, or both characters in a couple, killing them off altogether. Generally to move forward another character's plot. When discussing this trope, TV Tropes says, LGBT characters are viewed as more expendable than their heteronormative counterparts. Queer characters are more likely to die than straight characters. Indeed, it may be because they seem to have less purpose compared to straight characters, or that the supposed natural conclusion of their story is an early death. And they're right, a lot of queer characters die. This trope is among ones that are so prevalent that there are scenes in horror movies now making fun of it.
You're black! I'm gay! We are so dead!
But why? Where did this trope come from? Once upon a time, this was done by LGBTQ+ artists who wanted any chance at representing themselves in media, and that was the only way to do it. Nowadays, it's used by primarily cishet creators for shock value, although I'd argue it loses the shock part of that when queer characters are basically red shirts. To discuss the origin of this trope as it currently exists, we're gonna go back quite a few decades, to 1930. In 1930, a code was put into place called the Motion Picture Production Code, though it's more commonly known as the GAYS Code. The code was a list of limitations on what major motion pictures were allowed to depict based on morality, specifically very heavily Christian, oppressive class morality. The first general principle of the GAYS Code states, "No picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin." They go on to list specific things that are forbidden from media, which includes Section 2.4, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. That basically covered anything that was seen as deviating from normal cishet marriage activity. And while it's incredibly vague, it's pretty safe to say that all LGBTQ+ characters were covered under that. As established in the general principle, the audience was not meant to believe that any characters that engaged in this sex perversion were morally correct doing so. So the only way to include LGBTQ+ characters in media at all was to have them punished by the writing, generally by suddenly dying or losing their minds before the end of the work. So that's how it was, and by the time the code was finally dropped in 1968, the idea that LGBTQ+ character equals death had become so deeply ingrained in writing and movies that writers just kept doing it, even when it was no longer necessary. There are various examples of barrier gaze that have garnered quite a bit of media attention. Popular examples including Lexa's death from the 100, Adam's death from Voltron, and Tara's death from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The earliest example of this trope, past the GAYS Code, is believed to be Executive Suite in 1976. There was a very short-lived gay plot involving two characters named Julie and Leona. In episode 10, Julie confessed her feelings to Leona. In episode 11, Leona reciprocated those feelings, but then got upset by a sudden sexuality crisis that came from confessing to a woman, stormed off. Julie followed her, They walked into the street and Julie got hit by a car and died. That plot started and ended immediately. The most common question I see in relation to this trope is, why is this an important thing to bring up? How is this different than just characters dying? Why is this specific trope noteworthy? And there are a couple factors here. The first I'm going to mention is ratio. There are so few LGBTQ plus characters in media, and so many of them die. If you have 100 characters and you kill off one of them, then you have 99 characters left. You've only killed off 1% of your whole cast. If you have 98 cishet characters and 2 queer characters, and you kill one of those 2, then you've only killed off 1% of the overall cast and 50% of all of your queer characters. That would leave you with 1 queer character and 98 cishet characters. If you were instead to kill off one of the cishet characters, then you're killing off 1 out of 98 and you have 97 left. The ratios are just drastically different. According to an Autostraddle infographic which analyzed TV shows in 2016, they found over 18,000 cishet characters, 383 queer female characters. Of those 383, about 25% of them died, and 30, not 30%, 30 of those characters got happy endings. If you just add those two numbers together, make it 18,383, take those 30, that's 0.16% of all characters are queer women who get a happy ending. Imagine going to watch TV and knowing that the chance of you seeing a character like yourself that gets a happy ending is less than 1/4%. That's nothing. And the other factor I want to talk about in regards to this trope is the writing. On average, examples of bury your gays tend to involve LGBTQ plus characters who have noticeably less screen time, characterization, and development than their cishet counterparts. Going back to that Autostraddle infographic, of the dead queer female characters they analyzed, 28 were main characters, 20 were recurring, and 47 of them were guest characters. Over half of queer female characters were in less than half the show they appeared in, and about 3/4 of those characters were in less than 25% of their show. And that's not even getting into the number of queer characters that are introduced solely to die. Actually, I am going to get into that. In Voltron, Adam was introduced in a flashback and then died before he was able to reunite with his main character, ex/love interest. In Fear the Walking Dead, Thomas Abigail was introduced in a flashback and bitten before he was able to reunite with his significant other. He was already dying by the time they finally reached his house in Mexico. In The Exorcist show, Julia was introduced in a flashback where she was in a car and died in a car crash less than a minute after she was first introduced. In Teen Wolf, Emily was introduced in a camping scene where she and her girlfriend were making out and then they were attacked by a swarm of bugs. Emily tripped, and later in that episode, her body was found pretty brutalized. And this trope is not just in TV. Let's take Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 2, for example. Matthew. He goes from introducing himself to Clementine to dead within a few minutes. The other side of this coin is that some characters die because they're gay. They die immediately after coming out. Lexa and Julie, both of which I mentioned earlier, are examples of that, where they die pretty much immediately after their confession scenes, especially if the feelings are reciprocated. In The Arrangement, the moment Deanne wanted to be serious about her relationship with Mason, Mason died off screen. And you know what? Let's take a fairly recent example, a really recent and really literal example of this. In Supernatural, which is already pretty known for killing off all of their lesbian characters, Castiel got sent to a place worse than hell because he confessed his feelings to Dean, and then is never featured in the show ever again. But the thing about this trope is that not every queer character dying falls into bury your gays. So how do you distinguish if their death is an example of bury your gays? I say there's 3 things to focus on: quantity, quality, and value. 2 necessary criteria, and then a 3rd optional but often relevant one. The first is quantity. How many LGBTQ plus characters are there? Are they vastly outnumbered by cishet characters? And what's the ratio of who dies? The second is quality. How are the LGBTQ plus characters written? Are they treated worse by the writing? For example, are they given less screen time, less character development, less dimensionality? Also really common in bury your gays examples. The writing of the overall work is very cis-heteronormative. The LGBTQ plus characters are explicit deviations, and it's very safe to assume that everyone else who's not explicitly stated otherwise is cishet. And the third, which is not a requirement for this trope, but is something that very often goes along with it: value. Is the death valuable? Does it make sense? Or were they killed off for shock value? Is death the natural conclusion of their story? Does it make sense within the context of what's going on? Or is it a bullet missing its target, a crossbow bolt missing its target, another bullet missing its target? And for this last little section here, I did my own research into a show that I think contains perfect examples of this trope. The show I looked into is AMC's The Walking Dead. In the runtime of the 10 seasons so far, there have been 416 named characters, not including people who are introduced as walkers or already dead. Of those 416 characters, 47 have been classified as main characters. Unrelated to the trope here, but that is too many main characters. If you have 47 main characters, you've gone too far. Also in those 416 characters, there have been 9 queer characters. And of those 9, 4 are still alive. Looking at the 5 who died, Alicia was in 2 episodes, introduced in 1, died the 2nd. Denise appeared in 9 episodes of the 15 she was alive, but only really spoke or had any real significance in a couple of those. Eric was physically present in 17 of the 41 episodes he was alive, and spoke in 9 of those 17. Again, usually only a line or 2. And the 4th character I'm going to talk about in this section, Paul, Jesus, his actor actually quit the show because of how badly the writing of it was neglecting his character. He'd rather not be in the show at all than deal with what they were doing to him. I will note for the 5th character of those who died, Tara. Tara was a main character, was in a lot of episodes, had character arcs, her own relationships, feelings, development, etc. And she died in a moment that the show was building up to. I don't think her death alone, not taken within the context of all the others who have died, would be classified as bury or gays. But hey, let's look at some percentages. In The Walking Dead, queer characters have accounted for 2.6% of all of the characters. Of those characters, ones that are still alive are 0.96% of all characters. The ratio is a little bit better with main characters, where queer characters account for 10.6% of all mains. Of these 9 queer characters, 7 of them were introduced very late season 5 or later. The complaint that's most often used against people complaining about bury or gays in The Walking Dead is, oh, well, it's the apocalypse. Everyone dies. Well, 1, it's not actually the apocalypse. It's a fictional show that people are consciously choosing who dies and who doesn't. There is very little chance in who dies. But also, more percentages. Cishet characters who are confirmed as still alive make up 9.38% of all the characters. Cishet characters who were classified as unknown, which means they were alive when they were last seen but have not been seen in a while, is 11.78%. That means about 21% of all the characters are cishets who are either confirmed alive or were alive when last seen. That means you're looking at 21% versus 0.26%. 21% and 0.25% are not the same at all. The ratio is still way off. And so looking at The Walking Dead quantity, the ratio is way off, as I just showed. Quality, the queer characters are given significantly less screen time, less development, to the extent that one of the actors fully quit because of how poorly they were writing his character. And value, aside from Tara, most of these characters died very suddenly, with no build-up. Denise died mid-sentence. Eric realized he was shot mid-sentence. Jesus was stabbed in the back by a threat they didn't know was there while talking to Aaron. I don't remember Alicia's death. Looked into it. Alicia's death was not so much for shock value because she was a bad guy killed by one of the good guys, but hey, she was the first female character classified as an antagonist. So, like, win for the gays, right? Could do a whole other thing about how queer characters are villainized and often the bad guys. In conclusion, Bury Your Gays is not just about queer characters dying, but the context in which they die. And I think this is described well by another quote from TV Tropes. The problem isn't merely that gay characters are killed off. The problem is the tendency that gay characters are killed off in a story of mostly straight characters, or when the characters are killed off because they are gay. So that's the trope. It sucks because it's really hard to find queer characters and then feel safe getting attached to them because of how often they die. And I know that queer people are not the only minority that are treated really badly and in that manner by writing. It's an all-around awful problem. I wanted to talk about this trope specifically because I have a second follow-up video of sorts of a piece of media that will have dead queer characters that is not an example of Bury Your Gays. Anyone know me well enough to guess which media that's going to be? It's kind of obvious. And coming back from hiatus very soon. To close out, remember, quantity, quality, value. And if you are an LGBTQ plus person viewing all this media, remember that your value as a person is so much more than just inciting someone else's character growth. I am glad to see LGBTQ plus writers and directors and such getting into the field, seeing self-made stuff not quite controlled by Hollywood standards on platforms like YouTube, and seeing people try and battle the tropes like this. I certainly hope there is a day in the future where media is more representative of the real population of the world and also doesn't treat anyone who deviates from the norm badly like they do now. With how things are changing, I do at least have confidence that there will be more options away from that trope to come. For now, this is it. Ciao.